The Space Coast is closing out a record year in 2025 with more than 100 launches supported, and that's just the beginning. Big players like SpaceX and Blue Origin are preparing to facilitate larger rockets and higher launch cadences, both with Starship and the recently announced New Glenn 9x4. ULA is also debuting Vulcan hardware and facilities that will hopefully allow them to launch more often, all while newcomers like Stoke and Relativity hope to debut their rockets in the next 12 months. And if that wasn't enough, we may just be 2 months away from sending humans back to the moon for the first time in more than 50 years. You guys know the drill. I'm Max Evans for NSF, and we have all of that coming up and more on this month's Space Coast Update. As usual, I won't be alone today as we have both Sawyer and Marty here with us to help break everything down and explain more on the latest news. Let's begin by checking in on SpaceX's Roberts Road facility, their main hub for all activities here on the Space Coast. One of their major milestones of 2025 has been the return of Starship launch hardware construction to Roberts Road. Over the last several months, SpaceX has been assembling a new orbital launch mount to be used at LC-39A's Starship launch site. Since our last flyover, SpaceX has since rolled said launch mount out to the pad and installed it over the flame trench. The mount itself was built underneath a rolling tent so it could be protected from the elements, and during this past flight, we spotted the stands where it had been sitting during construction. At the moment, these stands remain empty, but maybe not for much longer. Going into 2026, SpaceX is preparing to build 2 additional Starship launch pads at Space Launch Complex 37, so we may see new launch mount hardware arrive in the not too distant future at Roberts Road, just as we saw before. And speaking of which, the 2 launch pads at Slick 37 will also have their own bespoke set of launch and catch towers, the first of which is currently being built at Roberts Road. All 9 tower modules have been assembled and should be rolling out once 37 is ready to accommodate. However, that may still be a few months away as the pad foundations really haven't even started yet. But once in place and the tower's base has been assembled, these modules should be rolled in and stacked rather quickly. And just as a quick reminder of where each of these modules go, here's a quick rundown. Modules 1, 2, and 3 make up the bottom third of the tower, with modules 1 and 2 having access levels to the chopsticks and the carrier system. Modules 4 and 5 make up the middle of the tower where the ship's quick disconnect arm is attached to and contains various access points to both it and other critical hardware. Modules 6, 7, and 8 are some of the simplest in design as there's no cryogenic plumbing running through them at all. The tower is then capped by Module 9 where the pulleys and crown block will be located for the tower's carriage system. While teams work on the foundations at 37, I'm sure they will also be outfitting these modules with as much hardware as they possibly can prior to stacking and saving as much time as possible once at the pad. On prior flights, we had seen some of the earlier tower modules receiving some auxiliary hardware such as handrails, internal stairs, and the central elevator shaft. All hardware that is now visible in the rest of the modules as well. Perhaps closer to rollout, we may also spot the installation of cryogenic plumbing and high pressure lines as well. Now, the addition of all this hardware, of course, makes them heavier and thus a bit trickier to stack, but SpaceX could make use of the LR-13000 crane they currently have stationed at LC-39A. Also around the modules, we can see that SpaceX has been assembling a set of chopsticks and carriage system for the first tower at Slick 37. Since our last flight, teams have welded hardware of the shoulder section of the chopstick arms. The carriage system itself has also received half of the arms needed for connecting to the actual launch tower rails. And while all of that continues, there remains some hardware at Roberts Road that's still meant for Pad A. This includes the ship quick disconnect arm, which has been seeing a great deal of progress in the last couple of months. SpaceX has really kicked it into high gear and has installed most of the hardware like we see at Pad 2 and Starbase. The arm itself is taking up about half of the rolling tent, while the other half is covering the booster QD carriages for the LC-39A launch mount. These are the structures that directly connect to Super Heavy boosters to supply them with both propellant and power. There's also some random tank farm hardware east of Hangar X2, which has been used over the last several months to stage hardware like pump sleds and valve assemblies. We've seen quite a few of these passing by our Space Coast Lab 24/7 cameras at the press site on their way to Pad A. 2025 has been a year of resurgence for Starship operations in Florida with all of this rapid progress happening, and is an epic change of pace. Yes, they've built tower sections and they've made progress over at Pad A, but that's really all that we've been able to report on and is years old news at this point. It's been a real waiting game while Starbase had priority. One of the most obvious signs of more serious development here is the rapid construction so far of Florida's very own Giga Bay, which is where SpaceX will be building and refurbishing Starship vehicles. Since our last flight, SpaceX assembled an extra 2 tower cranes at the Giga Bay construction area, and steel is rising on the east side of the foundation. We also mentioned how they hadn't completed the base floor on that eastern side back then as well, but it looks to be finished now. From what we could see, they seem to be up to level 2 on the western wall, up to level 3 on the central wall, and they just started level 1 on the eastern wall. As it stands now, it's already massive, but there is still a very long way left to go. And by a long way left to go, I mean that even the central wall, which is currently the tallest, is only about halfway up to its intended height. Halfway. It'll be interesting to see how long it takes for the main structures to be completed and exactly when SpaceX decides to be using the space here once V3 boosters and ships arrive here by barge. If they want to launch Starship as soon as possible from Florida, either they finish Giga Bay at ludicrous speeds, or they may have to consider some outdoor storage options of sorts. Maybe if they had like a really big tarp or tent. Jokes aside, it is interesting to wonder about these sorts of timelines. When do you think we'll see the first Starship vehicles arriving at the Cape? And will this whole timeline be affected by the recent failure of Booster 18 in Starbase? Humor me then. Grab your calendars and mark when you guys might think it'll happen. However, if you don't have an actual physical calendar, we might be able to help you out with that. Just head over to shop.nasaspaceflight.com and pre-order your 2026 NSF calendar. We've got 2 different designs for both Starship and general spaceflight, which includes a variety of photos from around the Cape and others with supporting info for each image. It actually looks really, really good, so please check these out. Once you have that in hand, go ahead and write down your actual timeline guesses. Now I'll go ahead and hand it off to Marty to have a look at Blue Origin's progress and all of the recently super exciting announcements, because boy has there been a lot.
We'll get to these announcements in a bit, but let's first have a look at Blue's facilities in Exploration Park, starting with the 2CAT building. Last time it was sitting empty, but now there's a tank inside. 2CAT stands for Second Stage Cleaning and Testing Facility, and as that name suggests, the tank inside will eventually become a New Glenn second stage. Over the last year we've seen a few of these second stage tanks, and Blue has been producing New Glenn second stages at a good pace, which bodes very well for the future of the rocket's launch cadence. Of course, the whole reason we can see all this right now is because the building is currently missing its door. Last year one of the tests was just a bit more energetic than intended and damaged the building. These views might not last long though, as we see Blue making progress with a replacement door. In addition to repairing existing buildings, Blue is also working to expand the campus by a whole lot. Workers are preparing grounds for a massive expansion to the south. A recent permit application shows how the plans have changed. 6 of the 7 buildings have now been consolidated into one massive building, and Blue clearly has big plans that need a whole lot of space. And to that end, they're also expanding the main factory building. The structure for that expansion has gone up, and it's already mostly enclosed with exterior cladding. This space will be used for composites manufacturing, perhaps for New Glenn massive fairing, which, as we'll talk about soon, may get even bigger. And on that topic we saw workers assemble some fairing-shaped structures outside one of the buildings. Another new building, the metal forming facility, looks increasingly finished, with the building now fully enclosed. Work continues at the site though, as Blue has just started foundation work right next to the building. More foundation work is also going on at the hardware integration facility. The building will be one of the very last stops for New Glenn hardware before it's heading to the launch pad. So on that note, let's now fly over to the launch pad ourselves. Launch Complex 36 or LC-36 was of course the site of New Glenn's recent second flight. Last time our team flew, the rocket was being readied for a flight inside the horizontal integration facility, and now its first stage, named Never Tell Me the Odds, is back for the refurbishment, following its very successful landing. This has likely created a bit of a logistical issue for Blue, as the hangar now houses this stage and also the upper stages for the next 2 flights. That's right, the third second stage on the production line was transported in the summer and test fired in August. And now the 4th second stage is out there as well, getting ready for testing. To clear some space, Blue moved the stage 1 and 2 simulators outside, which are now clearly visible from the air. But what are the odds that the booster from Flight 2 will get assigned another mission? Well, the short answer is that we don't know yet, and the long answer is that Blue has to decide whether to use this booster for the next mission or to wait for the next booster to roll off the production line. All of that depends on what they found when expecting Never Tell Me the Odds. We don't know all that much about the next flight anyway. There has been some talk that it might carry the Blue Moon Mark 1 lunar lander, but they could very well assign it to another mission depending on payload availability. We really need Blue to announce some plans before we can say anything for sure. The company did reveal its future plans for New Glenn, and it's a massive upgrade. Literally. First, they'll focus on the current version, now known as 7x2, for its engine configuration. One of the upgrades will be propellant subcooling, which helps fit more propellant in the tanks and thus get more performance out of the rocket. We were already able to guess this prior to the announcement, as we had been tracking a few things, like new nitrogen tanks arriving at the Cape, which didn't look to be for SpaceX based on the contractor they used for shipping. They eventually turned out to be for Relativity, but more about that later. Wondering whether they could be for Blue, we noticed that they had been clearing an area next to the liquid oxygen tank farm this summer, all thanks to satellite photos from our friend Harry Stranger. And then there was a letter earlier this year which mentioned Blue getting money from the state of Texas to upgrade their engine test facility for BE4 to use subcooled propellants. It later turned out that we had also missed something in our previous flyover. 3 subcoolers had arrived at the pad, and we didn't really expect them to be needed this soon. But it just goes to show that even if we're trying to look everywhere around the Cape, some things still escape us. And that said, we do post our flyover pictures to members, so anyone with an eye for detail can peer over them and make sure we don't miss a thing. So while the tanks were not for them, it seems like Blue will soon begin upgrading the pad's tank farm to have subcooling capabilities. Other upgrades may be in the plans, as well as 2 new cranes are now on site, one near the hydrogen tank farm and the other closer to the Blue Moon test area. In the shorter term, New Glenn is getting propellant subcooling and also a boost in thrust, but there's also a new and even larger version of the rocket in the works, New Glenn 9x4. It will be taller and much more powerful, with 9 engines on the first stage and 4 on the second, which is also what gives it its name. In addition to that, it features the larger fairing I mentioned earlier. Where will it launch from? Well, the render images showed it launching from the current pad, so that's an option. But Blue also owns LC-12 to the north, which would be a very nice place for another pad built from scratch. Or they could even do both. Either way, it's for certain that there will be a lot of exciting progress from Blue to look forward to in the near future. Moving north along the Space Coast, we encounter Stoke Space's Launch Complex 14. Over the last year or so, they've been working on getting the site ready to launch the fully reusable Nova rocket, which is supposed to take off for the first time next year. From the air, it looks like the pad is nearing completion. Perhaps one of the most important changes is visible on the launch mount, on which pipework has been installed. Presumably, these are lines for the propellants and/or other commodities, as Stoke has already been able to test the water deluge system without them. The horizontal integration facility hasn't visibly changed since our last visit. The doors were open this time, so we could see right through it, and there isn't much inside, but that's also kind of the purpose of this building, a big space for assembling rockets. In general, the complex looks much more finished now, with the terrain properly graded and most of the heavy machinery gone. They've even started installing some of the smaller accoutrements, such as a windsock. We haven't had an update about the rocket side of things in quite a while, but hopefully that's progressing just as well. And with a bit of luck, we'll start to see LC-14 coming into action for testing soon. North of Stoke is Relativity's Launch Complex 16, which the company is developing in order to support its large Terran R rocket. We've spotted many changes since our last aerial visit, and the most obvious one is perhaps the water tower, which will provide the water for the pad's water deluge system that protects Terran R and its supporting infrastructure from the massive amounts of energy released from the rocket engines at liftoff. The tower's top section now looks complete, but that doesn't mean it has reached its final height yet. It's supposed to be about 93 meters tall when fully assembled, and for that, the tank will need to be raised substantially. Supposedly, completion for the water tower is scheduled for January 9th, so I guess we'll see it rise soon enough. Meanwhile, the horizontal integration facility continues to receive more of its exterior cladding, so it's starting to look like an actual building now. A lot has changed at the propellant farms. On the liquid oxygen side, Relativity has installed 2 more vertical tanks and 3 large horizontal tanks. Remember that we spotted these 3 mystery tanks a while ago? Well, we first thought they were for Blue, but as we can see, that was clearly wrong. It was just a happy coincidence that they arrived at the same time we noticed the work at Blue's pad. Now, these tanks were originally labeled for nitrogen, but nitrogen tanks can often be modified for liquid oxygen, and that's probably what Relativity has done here. So that clears up that mystery. The methane side, or liquid natural gas, also received some upgrades. We're not seeing any new tanks on that side yet, but they've got an area prepared for them. One thing has appeared since our last flyover, a flare stack. And from the looks of it, it's pretty much finished. This is the first of 2 flare stacks we'll see at the pad. It seems that Relativity is taking the same approach as Blue Origin. One flare stack, the one they've already built, is for the tank farm, and the other will take care of the boil-off from the rocket. Some things have disappeared since the last time, presumably some Terran 1 infrastructure that is no longer needed now Relativity has abandoned the rocket. Particularly 4 horizontal tanks have been removed from an area marked as the water farm. That makes sense considering the massive water tower. Finally, Relativity is working on the launch pad itself. In the company's last update they said that rebar and forms are going in for the launch mount itself. They've also started work on the foundations for the pad support facility. And indeed, we can see a lot of work going on in these areas. Like Stoke, Relativity plans to launch Terran R next year. They're certainly working hard on getting it done. Now I'll hand it over to Sawyer, who will continue our tour up the Space Coast with SpaceX's facilities.
Thanks, Marty. Moving north of LC-14 is SpaceX's Space Launch Complex 37, which Max has referenced quite a lot earlier in the episode, as it's going to be used for Starship. In our last flight, we mentioned that major construction work couldn't start until the then ongoing Environmental Impact Statement, or EIS, was finalized. Well, just a couple weeks ago, the Department of the Air Force released the final version of this EIS and released its Record of Decision, or ROD. The ROD states that the Department of the Air Force has decided to allow SpaceX to redevelop Slick 37 for Starship launch and landing operations. They will also execute the Real Property Agreement and other agreements between the Space Force and SpaceX so they can use Slick 37. Space Launch Delta 45 will also work on approving the Starship program on the range, looking at what sort of modifications might be needed for Starship to have access to the eastern range. They're the ones that keep the airspace and waterways clear during launches, by the way. In other words, SpaceX can modify the launch site to build the towers, the mounts, and all the other stuff, but it'll take a bit more work to figure out a way to operate Starship out of the Space Coast. The ROD includes a list of certain mitigations that SpaceX will have to work on in order to carry out those operations. This is not a huge surprise, as we've seen in the past that because of the sheer size of Starship, SpaceX has had to do some work to compensate for that. At the Cape, things will be a bit more complicated than, for example, at Starbase, since they'll also have to work with other providers. But it's likely that this too will get figured out eventually. With the environmental paperwork complete and the approval to develop Slick 37, we're now waiting to see when foundation work will start. For the last several months, SpaceX has had a limited right of entry, which has allowed them to demolish legacy structures from the Delta IV program. But in terms of groundwork, all they've done is flatten the area and prepare it for the start of foundations. We'll keep a close eye on our next flyover, as I'm sure by then, this foundation work might already be underway. If SpaceX were to start them right at the beginning of 2026, and if the first pad at 37 were to take about as long as pad 2 at Starbase, then we could see a first launch from there in the second half of 2027. But you may have noticed that sentence had a lot of ifs in it. So we'll see. North of Slick 37 is the world's most active launch pad, SpaceX's Slick 40. Just this year alone, it has hosted more than 70 launches so far, and combined with the nearly 30 launches from LC-39A, these pads have allowed the Space Coast to reach over 100 launches in a calendar year for the very first time. SpaceX may repeat a similar feat next year and also may sprinkle in a Starship launch or two. They'll also be able to have their own landing zone at Slick 40, unlike before where they had to land at the former Launch Complex 13. There, SpaceX built 2 landing zones, LZ-1 and LZ-2, which they had been using since the first successful landing of a Falcon 9 back in 2015. The lease to that complex expired this year, and to comply with new rules from the Eastern Range, SpaceX opted to build a brand new landing zone within Pad 40. Since our last flight, the landing zone has been covered in concrete and looks about ready. If anything, it may be missing the traditional SpaceX logo like we've seen at other landing sites, although at the same time, we've seen SpaceX not care that much about their hardware being pretty for long. I mean, just ask the drone ship teams about it. So maybe they won't bother painting anything at the pad just yet. We'll see. Oh, and of course, we can see they're putting together a new booster stand where they'll process landed boosters before sending them back to Hangar X for refurbishment. All in all, it seems like this pad may be ready to support landing operations just in time for the new launch season of 2026. A lot has happened as well over at SpaceX's other launch pad, Launch Complex 39A. This pad is not only hosting Falcon launches, but is also being worked on to support Starship launches. As Max explained earlier in the episode, since our last flight, teams have rolled and installed the Starship launch mount for 39A. It really was odd to see a piece of space hardware like that, which we normally associate with Starbase, out here in Florida. After the installation, SpaceX's Vice President of Launch, Kiko Donchev, posted a really crazy photo of the launch mount lift looking straight up from the bottom of the flame trench. Compared to Starbase's Pad 2, this launch mount rolled out with more hardware installed ahead of time. Likely because here in Florida, they used the larger and more powerful LR-13,000 crane rather than a tandem lift of two LR-11,000 cranes. Since that rollout, SpaceX has continued outfitting and working non-stop on that launch mount, and it may not be long until we see hardware such as the booster quick disconnect umbilicals make their way to 39A and begin being installed on it. While most of the work on the lower part of the flame trench is probably nearing completion, the flame trench walls are still being built up. Eventually, they should go up and be flush against the mount on each side of the trench, just like we see at Starbase. Since our last flight, a few more of these wall pieces have been installed, but there are a lot more still needed. In the last few weeks, we've also seen the SpaceX LR-11,000 crane at the pad get lowered and reconfigured, and it now features a longer boom. In this configuration, it should be able to be used for lifting the ship quick disconnect arm up on the tower, just like we saw recently at Starbase's Pad 2. Now on the tower side of things, since our last flight, SpaceX has installed the drawworks for the tower. The drawworks is what will allow the chopstick carriage system to travel up and down the tower once the wire rope has been reeved through the full pulley system. In other words, no drawworks, no sticks moving. Since our last flight, SpaceX has also brought and installed new subcoolers, both big and small, to the tank farm. We can now see a whole lot more progress putting all of them together, and it also seems like the area where the tank farm's power bunker will be may start to get its concrete pour now that groundwork seems to be complete. SpaceX also installed 4 new deluge tanks, 3 small and 1 large, which had previously been staged near the 39A hangar. Hopefully it won't be long until all of these major ground systems are complete and start being tested ahead of Starship's first launch from Florida. Now there are 2 remaining launch pads we haven't covered at the Space Coast, and one of those is ULA's Slick 41. Unlike the last time we flew, there was no mobile launch platform, better known as MLP, out there on the pad. But just a few days beforehand, that was not the case, as ULA had rolled out a brand new Vulcan MLP to the pad. The company has reworked their former Spacecraft Processing Operations Center, or SPOC, yes, like Star Trek, into their second vertical integration facility, which will be used to host and process Vulcan rockets dedicated to Amazon's LEO constellation. And yeah, since the last Space Coast update, they changed the name from Kuiper to LEO. I'm not a big fan of it, but what do you think? Let me know in the comments. The new MLP had been completed just a few weeks ago, so of course, it had to go out to the pad for testing to make sure it all works. With the testing completed, it rolled back to this renovated building and, per CEO Tori Bruno, may still need a bit more work, but the first Vulcan to be stacked in there might just be a few weeks away. Speaking of a few weeks away, if all is well, we should be under 2 months from Artemis II, the first crewed flight of SLS and Orion, and also the first crewed flight around the moon since 1972. In the week since our last flight, within the vehicle assembly building, teams at NASA's Exploration Ground Systems have been finalizing checkouts and testing of the combined SLS and Orion stack ahead of rollout and launch. Sometime in the next week or 2, there's a scheduled countdown demonstration test with the crew, which will be performed inside of the VAB. This will be one of the last major steps prior to the roll. In preparation for the rollout, the old shuttle mobile launch platform was seen being moved down the crawlerway out to Launch Complex 39B. During these operations, the platform, loaded with counterweights, simulates the weight of the SLS stack while rolling down the crawlerway. It prepares the ground for the upcoming roll and gives teams an opportunity at rehearsing the operation. If you're wondering about rollout timing, well, we think that may not happen until at least mid-January. SLS can't roll out to the pad too early because its flight termination system is certified by Space Launch Delta 45 to operate only for a certain amount of time. NASA can request waivers, and since Artemis I has modified the mobile launcher to be able to service that system at the pad without the need to roll back. But of course, you don't want to be relying on those backup options as your main option, hence the later rollout. Of course, we assume mid-January rollout because we believe NASA may still be targeting an early February lunar launch period. If, for whatever reason, they need to target a later launch period, then that'll likely delay the rollout by a similar amount of time. Once it's out of the pad, it'll go through a couple of weeks of preparations, checkouts, and testing. The crew will perform a dry dress rehearsal, and closer to launch, the rocket will go through an uncrewed countdown test, this time also loading it with propellants. Hopefully, all of that will be underway by the time of our next flight, and of course, we'll be streaming all of these major events right here on the NSF YouTube channel.
Well, that's a wrap for our last Space Coast update for 2025. As you can see, we have a lot to be stoked about in the next year or so keep your eyes peeled on Space Coast Live and any additional coverage that we're aiming to bring out. I'm Max Evans for NSF. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you guys next year.